Awesome, thank you. As she mentioned, I'm Joy Ebertz. I'm actually a principal software engineer at Split, and we're hiring in case you're looking. But yeah, so today I'm going to go over a little bit about who I am. I'm going to talk about why I actually went into management in the first place, and then talk about why I left management. Talk a little bit about how my actual transition back from management was, and then also get into some of the knowledge I was able to transfer. So the thing I didn't put on this agenda is throughout all of this, I'm also going to be comparing the manager and the IC track, as like that was a lot of my thought process when I left management. And I'm also going to talk a lot about like some of the similarities and crossover, thus the knowledge I was able to transfer. So first of all, who am I? We went over a lot of this just a second ago, but I like to blog. I have a blog on Medium. I like to read, mostly fantasy. I like to bake, mostly pies. And I like to run, mostly really long distances on trails. But all of that is not why you're here today. So who am I professionally? Again, I like to blog. So I blog about both running, but also I do a lot of blogging about DEI topics, career topics, and actually some technical blog posts as well. I've worked at a variety of places, Box, Microsoft, Split, and a super tiny startup. I'll get more into that in a second. I'm a backend developer these days. I write mostly in Java right now, but I've done a few other things in the past. I've spent time at multiple companies now working on breaking up monoliths into microservices. I've spent time creating REST API standards for multiple companies again. And I've worked on authorization quite a bit. This is the symbol for OPA, which is the open source project that we're using at our current company for our authorization. So a little bit more about my actual career path. So when I graduated college, my first job was at Microsoft, where I was a software development engineer. From there, so I spent about 1.5 years there, and I left for entirely personal reasons. And then I went to a super tiny startup, and I didn't have an official job title, and I really just did everything because I was the first engineer that they hired. And when I left, there were 4 people total, 2 engineers. So any problem that we had, I had to figure it out. So I spent 1.5 years there. A lot of why I left was actually because I felt like I had sort of maxed out what I could learn. At first, like I mentioned, I had to do everything. So at first I learned a ton. You learn so much when you have to do absolutely everything within a startup. But at some point, I realized I know I'm writing really bad JavaScript, but there's no one here to tell me how to do it better. And so I wanted to
Sorry,
go out there.
Joy, I'm going to have to interrupt you for a second. I think your screen is frozen and your slides aren't advancing. So
Oh,
I'm going
no.
to remove you and then we can get back there. Yeah. Let's try again. I'm so sorry to interrupt. That looks better. Do you want to just make sure that we can advance? It was stuck on the first slide.
It's really weird. Is that going?
It's not, no. Maybe try going to view.
I can try sharing my whole screen whole screen instead of.
While we do that, everybody, put in the chat, what are you looking forward to this weekend? Talk amongst yourselves.
Oh, this is going to do the wrong side, isn't it? Yep, no. Does that work any better?
Let's try advancing. There we go. Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so where was I? The reason I left the startup is because I wanted somebody to mentor me, somebody to tell me where I could be doing things better. So from there, I joined Box as a software engineer. While at Box, I actually spent 8 years at Box, so there's going to be a number of different Box things here. But at some point, I got promoted to senior software engineer. From there, I became what they called a TLM, or tech lead manager. TLM was not an official promotion, but instead it was a recognition that somebody was in the transition from an individual contributor to a manager. So the actual role spanned a huge range of responsibilities. It could mean on one end that you were basically an individual contributor, but maybe you were like helping lead a couple projects or something. Or it could mean on the other end, like right before I got promoted to manager, I was doing everything with managing my team except for like the actual sign off with HR sort of thing. So I gave them their performance reviews, the whole 9 yards, and then just the official manager like signed off on them. So from there, I got promoted to engineering manager. And I spent probably, I would say, between the end part of the TLM when I was doing most of the managing and the time I spent as a manager, I was doing that for about 2 years. And then I decided I really didn't like it. So I transitioned back to a staff engineer. You'll notice that I actually have a bump here in the IC title. They made me essentially reapply or like do the equivalent to a promotion case. And then they decided afterward if I was performing at a staff level or if I was performing at a senior suite level. So I managed to get that staff level title at the point. From there, I got promoted to senior staff. And then by this time, this was all, like I mentioned earlier, 8 years. So I had spent a lot of time at Box and across a bunch of different teams at that point. So I wanted to try something new. So that was when I moved over to Split. And while at Split, I have a title change, but it's not really a promotion. This is more of, we don't actually have official titles within Split. And when talking to our head of engineering, we do have a rubric and levels, but when talking to our head of engineering, when I first joined, he told me to keep the same title. And recently when I talked to him, he said to use principal. So, and I do feel like that reflects most of what I do these days. But the majority of this talk, we are going to focus on this middle section. So going from senior SWE to engineering manager and back to staff. So why did I go into management in the first place? So honestly, I had never really considered management. If people had asked me what I wanted to be, I probably would have said like architect or something. I like vaguely knew that I liked the IC track. The management side didn't really interest me that much, but I knew I wanted to increase my level and see what happened from there. However, at some point, my manager and a few other people, one of my mentors, identified that I had a bunch of leadership skills. So this is things like I was pretty good at managing the projects that our team had. I was pretty good at helping motivate the team, keeping us on track, making sure we were moving towards project deadlines, that sort of thing. I was pretty good at leading discussions. So I was good at making sure that we weren't circling around the same questions, but we could, make decisions on some things and keep moving forward with the project. I'm pretty good at seeing the big picture. So, in Myers-Briggs, there's the people who see the trees and the people who see the forest. I'm one of the forest people, which isn't to say that you can't succeed and you can't be a great leader if you're a trees person. But one of the things from higher levels is typically you want to be able to see how your projects fit into the larger picture and how the smaller things fit into what everyone else is doing to make sure that things are lining up and going in the correct direction. And then I'm pretty good at communication. So like I mentioned before, I keep a blog and obviously I'm talking right now. So communication are things that I tend to like to do. So as I mentioned, people identified that I had these skills, and one of my mentors, so I still wasn't really even manager wasn't even on my radar. One of my mentors, however, sat me down and was like, you need to become a manager. And I was like, what? He was like, no, really, you'd be good at it. And then this was over a series of a few conversations, but he kept pushing me. He kept saying no, I think this is a really good opportunity. I think this is something you should really do. So then obviously, because, I can't take one person's word for it, I went to a second mentor and I was like, my mentor is saying this one thing. What do you think? And she was like, yeah, it seems like a great idea. You should try management. So I went into management. But then why did I leave management? The short answer is that I hated it. but why? I hated it is not actually a useful answer to any of you out there. So we're going to get into why. So I basically evaluated this on a few different angles. So the first thing I thought about is what gives you energy. So what makes you energized at the end of the day and what really just drains you down. So things that drain me, interviewing. So talking to strangers, especially small talk, this is not something I like doing. This is really stressful to me. And as a manager, you have to interview everyone that you could possibly hire for your team. As an individual contributor, especially a senior one, they make you do a lot of interviews too. But as a manager, like there's no choice. Giving feedback. So as I quickly discovered, different people are very different. So I had some people on my team who like I had to be super, super blunt before they got the feedback. And I had other people on my team who I would try to soften up the feedback as much as possible and they would still freak out. So having to navigate this, like, how do you make sure that people are going to be okay? And like, I'm also a person who's very empathetic, so I don't like upsetting people. So I found this challenging. Micro communications. So I mentioned that I like writing, I like communicating, but the thing for me is I will write a blog post and then I will sit on it for a day and then I'll come back and I'll revise it. And then I'll like schedule for publishing the next day, but I'll let it like sit in the back of my head overnight. And if something comes up where I'm like, oh, that wasn't quite written right, I still have time to pull it out or, you know, revise it again before it actually goes out. I like to think about these things. However, when you're doing micro communications, you have to be writing all of these emails constantly. You're giving updates, you're like explaining what your project's doing, and it's just constant. And I found that really draining because I still worry about if I framed things correctly, but I don't actually have the time to make sure that I always do. And then just meetings in general. So I'm an introvert, and so obviously dealing with people can be draining for me. That's like standard introvert thing. And if you've ever tried to schedule a meeting with your manager, you know that most managers have fully packed calendars, and I was no exception to that. So the amount of time I spent with other people was just very draining to me. So what gives me energy? Doing things on my own, like solving problems, reading, working on my own, that I find that energizing. I know I just said I was an introvert, but actually solving problems in a small team where I know and trust the people, I actually find that super energizing. So I love tackling a really difficult problem and like bouncing ideas off of other people that I know and like coming to a better solution. I find that super energizing. And I really like finishing things. So this is a runner since I'm a runner, but I like finishing anything. Like, and a lot of IC tasks tend to have clearer finish lines, right? Like you completed that project, you released that feature, you fixed that bug, like there's clear finish lines. So that also gives me energy. So what drives and excites me? So at first, this is going to sound really similar to what gives me energy, right? Like what excites me, what gives me energy. The subtle difference here is more about the tasks themselves, which is more what I was getting at with the energy, versus the end results, right? Like, so in ultra running, we have this thing where we talk about different types of fun. There's type 1 fun, which is fun the whole time you're doing the activity. This is like going down a water slide, like it's great the whole time. There's type 2 fun, which is like running most really long races. Most of ultra running is type 2 fun. It's terrible for like huge portions of when you're doing it. Like you're hot, you're like dehydrated, you're tired, like why are you doing this? But when you finish, you're like, oh, that was awesome. I'm going to get out there and do it again, right? So that's type 2 fun. And that's exactly what I'm getting at here. I'm talking about things like maybe it's terrible, but if it's what you want to do at the end, it might still be worth it. So for me, what drives and excites me is helping other people. So a lot of managers do this, right? You're obviously mentoring your team, you're growing your team. But it turns out that on the senior IC track, you're also expected to mentor people around you. You're also supposed to try to help teach people. So I found that this was something that could apply to either track. I really like building things. Whether that's, you know, Legos or like crafting projects or code. Like I love building features. I love fixing bugs. I love that act of creation, which obviously much more on the IC side of things. And I love solving hard problems. I sort of mentioned this already, but I love like really thinking about something that's super difficult and coming up with a solution. And there's like a slight nuance here too, where managers also deal with really hard problems. I'm not going to try to say that they don't, but they tend to be more people problems. It's like, how do we make sure that the personalities of these people and their motivations and the like, you know, 3 external factors all work together so we get this project done. And it's a little bit harder to see the moving parts versus technical problems tend to be like, how do we fit within these space constraints, cost constraints, speed constraints, and still build this feature that's usable and whatever. Like there's still a ton of constraints, but it's a little bit clearer what those are. And so that's a little bit more the type of hard problem that excites me. And the final axis is really about how do you feel accomplishment? And honestly, this was probably the biggest thing for me out of all three of these. So it turns out that on the management side, you spend a lot of time planning, right? Like you're planning the next quarter, you're planning what the long-term vision for the team is going to be. Honestly, as a principal engineer, I do more of this than I would like as well, but it's still a little bit less than the managers. So there's that aspect. There's coaching. So, again, growing your team, giving them feedback, making sure everything is like working together from a people side of things. We often talk about managers being umbrellas, right? Like they're supposed to shield the team from all of those external things coming in. They're supposed to make sure that the team isn't getting interrupted by CS every time there's a bug. They're not getting interrupted by every single little issue as it comes in, right? They're trying to make sure that they get blocks of time to actually accomplish real things. And similarly, they're also expected to be bulldozers. They're supposed to clear the path for their teams. So you want to managers tend to, try to make sure that the team has the tools they need. They're like, they're not getting blocked by permissions, right? Like you're trying to make sure that actual development is as smooth and clear as possible. And they're generally, I honestly don't remember what this picture was for. So anyway, managers do a lot of really great things. Then on the IC side, there are things like mentoring. So this really does fall under both sides, to be honest. There's coaching people, there's giving advice. There's writing code. So there's like actually solving those problems, like I mentioned, like being able to fix a bug. And there's building new things, and there's cleaning up stuff as well, right? Like leaving the code base cleaner than it was, like making sure things are in a better state than where you found them. And quite honestly, so the thing that ties the manager things that I have here and the IC things is that on the manager side, it's much less obvious the relationship between your actions and the end result, versus on the IC side, it's very clear. So on the manager side, I'm not saying managers don't do a lot. If you've had a bad manager and a good manager, you will know that a good manager does a ton. However, it's like much less obvious that any given action is actually contributing toward making your team better, right? Like I could coach my engineer like, oh, maybe you should check out that other technology, but they might have done that anyway, right? Like I could tell somebody like, oh, I think we need to work on this project, but it might have happened anyway, right? Like all of these things, it's really hard to say because I did that thing, my team was successful. Versus on the engineering side, it's like, oh, I wrote that code and therefore the feature works. It's pretty obvious, right? Like if I didn't write that code, the feature wouldn't work. I wouldn't have done something. And like I said, it's not that managers aren't accomplishing things. And I knew this, I mentally knew this, but I couldn't feel it internally. And so it really felt to me like, even though I knew I was doing stuff, it really felt to me like I was, a hamster on a wheel. I was doing all this work and just wasn't getting anywhere. I wasn't doing anything. So that was something I really struggled with a lot. Okay, so because of all of that, I switched back. First of all, I wanted to mention really fast that it was actually easier to switch back than I expected. When I went into management, a lot of my friends went into management like around the same time I did, within a couple of years, or were thinking about it at least. Like it tends to come up for your peer group around the same time, right? And one thing that I constantly heard was like, I'm scared I'm going to lose my technical skills. I don't know if I want to become a manager because I like being technical, and like, I'm really scared I'm going to lose that. Or what if I hate it? Will I be able to transition back? Like, I don't know about this. And the thing I realized is that you actually, first of all, you actually lose less than you think you will. Like, especially if you're lucky enough to be like me and we're able to transition back at the same company, then you're going to be able to Like you already know the code base, you already know the features that they have, and sure, you may have missed out on like, a couple of years, but you're still probably a couple legs up on any new hire that they hire, right? So that's on one side. And then on the other side is, okay, so maybe you're transitioning to a new company at the same time. So you're interviewing, and like, sure, that's a little challenging, but brush up on some interviews and you can probably pull something off, right? So that part, you actually lose less technical stuff than you think you do. And then on the other side of things is the thing I've realized about being a software engineer is that the most important skill is learning to learn. And so if you're actually decent at this skill, then it doesn't matter if you have to totally learn everything else from here, because technologies are constantly changing. So a new hire would probably have to learn half this stuff anyway. So you're just kind of in the same boat as some of those other people out there. So again, not nearly as bad as most people were worried about. Okay, so finally talking a little bit about some of the transferable skills. So first of all, I wanted to just really fast compare the two ladders. It's worth noting that every company out there seems to have like vastly different exact definitions for these, and like exactly like slightly different ways that they line up. So don't focus too much on the like where I've placed the different titles. The thing that's important here is that as you move up on either track, on the management or the IC track, you're expected to have a bigger scope and influence. So when you first come in, typically, you're expected to solve small things, maybe with a lot of help. And then as you grow more and more senior, you're expected to solve larger and larger things more and more independently. And then eventually you're leading other people to solve these larger things. And then eventually, it's like engineering wide or company wide. So a lot of this is the same on either track. And that's kind of what I want to get into a little bit. So the first thing is related to that planning I was talking about earlier. It's around setting vision and direction. So on the manager side, typically you're deciding what your team's going to work on. While on the IC side, for example, I'm responsible for deciding the technical direction of our backend. So kind of identifying what are the big tech projects we should be working on, and how do we figure out what are the small pieces of those that we should be carving out now versus later, and like what's the most important thing based on what's happening within the company at the moment. So setting vision, setting direction. And then there's influencing. So if I have the most amazing vision ever, but I can't convince somebody else to get on board with it, then it really doesn't matter, right? Either as a manager or as an IC. Like as a manager, I have to convince my people that they really want to work on this thing. Otherwise, they're all going to leave, right? Or as an IC, like it's even more important. If I can't convince other teams that this is important, like none of the tech debt is going to get fixed. It's not going to happen. Communication. So again, convincing. So as a part of convincing people, you have to be able to communicate your ideas. You have to be able to tell them what you're convincing them of, right? So being a manager, a lot of it is communicating plans, communicating ideas, communicating what your team's working on, status, right? And then on the other side, there's a lot of like, okay, this is our long-term vision. This is how we're going to get there. This is like the things we need to focus on right now. And this is why it's important. And this is why you should care. Again, a lot of communication on both sides. I talked about this a lot already, so I'm not going to go into too much depth, but mentoring, being able to grow other people around you. At any senior level, you're expected to be up-leveling everyone around you. The really nice thing about having a super senior engineer on a team is typically that they can actually help grow the team. At first, it feels like, when I was a junior dev, a lot of times it felt like, oh, they're going to take all of the challenging like work away and I'm not going to be able to do anything. And that's typically not the case. Instead, they're going to be like, oh, in addition to the stuff we're already doing, we should be doing these 5 other things. And by the way, I don't have time to do it, so you're going to actually be working on that thing. And so it's actually a good way to get exposure upward. Understanding people and empathy. There's 2 sides to this. So one side is around that influencing thing. As a manager, I was forced essentially, right, to get to know all of my people. I started with 3 people reporting to me, and I eventually had, I think I had 4 or 5 direct reports, and then I had 5 additional like dotted line reports. And so I was meeting with all of these people, right? And you really get to understand how people are different, how people have different motivations and think about things differently. So it helps in terms of influencing to understand all of this, and you get a better insight into aligning incentives and how to make that actually happen. The other side of this thing too, though, is having been a manager, I understood managers better. So there's a lot of little things. I could probably give an entire talk on this topic, but one example here is that when I was a manager, I had a ton of engineers who would come to me and be like, "Do you have any feedback for me?" And my initial thought is like, okay, they're doing pretty well. They seem to be fine. I honestly have not really checked into their work super in depth since 2 weeks ago, so I can't give any direct pointers. No, sorry, I don't have feedback. Or like, oh yeah, you seem to be doing fine. Both of which are useless. Trust me, everybody agrees both of those are useless. However, if one of those people had come to me and said, that presentation I gave yesterday, how do you think it went? What do you think I can do to improve it, right? I would have had very, very specific feedback. So the thing there is not just asking for open-ended feedback, but instead asking for like specific things. So I was able to do that with my manager because I understood that I was going to get much, much better feedback if I did things like that than if I had just asked an open question. So yeah, the final thing I really wanted to leave you with here is that so I moved back and forth once. They talk a lot about career ladders. More and more you hear a lot of people talk about a career lattice. And I sort of did this, right? Like in that I moved to management and I moved back. But I actually know a lot of people who have moved back and forth a number of times, like 6 times, maybe more, right? So just because you try one thing, you don't have to stay there. You can move back again. Like your career is long, it's flexible. There's a lot of things you can learn over the course of the time. And the other thing I want to mention is that even though I mentioned I hated managing, I actually feel like I learned a lot and I do not regret my decision to go into management in the first place, right? So that's a like slight distinction. Like I would never do it again. That experience is done, but I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I did it once. So, yep. That's my talk about why I went into management and why I left.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joy. Everyone, if you can go ahead and toss some questions into the chat, we would love to start answering some questions for you. Here we go. What was the initial drive to management? I think this was answered, but what was your initial drive to management? Was it advancement?
Yeah, it was a little bit advancement. Honestly, I would say it was more like learning and growing. I would say for me, like knowing that I'm learning new things and I'm like growing my skill set is a little bit more important to me than the actual career ladder. And my mentor did position it like that to me. He was like, "You're going to learn all these skills. It's going to be great. You should do this." So that was part of it, definitely.
Awesome. All right. And then how much of a role do you think being an empathetic female played in others pushing you towards management?
I've really wondered about this. Yeah, I noticed at my company about the same time that it was all the women getting nudged towards management. I definitely do think that pushed me. That said, I mean, I do think it's also a skill that helps you in managing. So I don't necessarily think that's the empathetic part of that, not the being female part. That's pretty irrelevant. But yeah, the empathetic part I do actually think is helpful in being a manager. That said, like, because they were open to me completely going back at some point, I'm not upset.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I mean, it sounds like you had a lot of other qualities too that they very much appreciated. All right, I've got another question from Grace. Can you elaborate on what a staff engineer does in comparison to principal?
Again, this depends a lot on the company. So typically, I guess how I'm thinking about it right now is that staff engineer, typically you're going to be working across a couple of related teams. And so you're thinking about like, there may be like two very closely or three very closely related teams, thinking about their projects together and like what their larger problem space is together, versus principal for me right now, I'm working across all of the back-end engineering at my company. So there's another guy who I would say is my counterpart on the front end side. And basically I'm trying to drive the entire back-end vision as a whole and how we think about things.
Yeah, and I know it can be different at different companies too. Like my partner is a principal and he's on like a smaller team and there are multiple principals. So yeah, every company is different. We have a question from Shannon. Is it possible to move into management too early?
I would, that's such a tough question. Yes, probably. I do think it's valuable to have some basis in the technical understanding and understanding what it takes to actually build the software projects and some of that side of things. That said, like if that's your passion and if you're good at it and you have the opportunity, like I wouldn't stop you. I think it's worth trying. And if it doesn't work out, then you can try again later.
Totally. All right, we've got a question from Susan. Piggybacking on to Shannon's question, do you see any problem going into management too early and then trying to come back to IC or an IC role?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I had that weird like senior SWE/staff thing when I came back over to the IC side. And part of that was because everybody who had moved back to IC before me had already been a staff engineer when they went into management. And so for me, they were like, well, it feels fair to move you to staff engineer, but you weren't one before, so we're not really sure. So I think if you're willing to take the title cut, which at that point I was like, I mean, I think I deserve the staff title, but I really just want out of this no matter what title I end up with. So if you're willing to take that, then I don't think it's going to be a huge problem. But yeah, definitely a little more challenging.
Okay. Faye is asking if I'm on the fence about branching into management or sticking with IC, what are things I should ask myself?
So really, I would say those three questions I talked about. So like, how do you feel accomplishment? What excites you? And like, what gives you energy? And think through those three things. And like I mentioned too, I really don't regret doing management. So if you really are on the fence, I would say it's probably worth trying out, but everyone's different.
Yeah, and I like that you've said multiple times, like you can always go back. So if it's something you're really interested in and you kind of feel a pull, like it can't hurt.
Yeah,
trying it out.
And in fact, actually, that second mentor I talked to who really encouraged me to go into management, she was like, yeah, this is awesome, you're doing this. And then when I went back to IC, she was like, oh, that's awesome. And I was like, wait, what? You were so excited I went into management. And she was like, no, I just thought you needed to make a decision. You were like treading water too much. You needed to move forward in your career. And you did that. So
That's awesome. Thank you. Elena asks, what was the reaction of your team when they found out that you moved from management back to staff engineer?
That was such a hard conversation to have. Everybody's different. So some people were like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Some people seemed like kind of sad. I mean, mostly the general sentiment was like, oh, we're sad you're leaving. And I don't know if they were just saying that to me to be nice, but we're sad you're not going to be managing us, but oh, that's awesome. You're going to like do something you really like doing. So
kind of a bittersweet thing.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Anna Sher-Wilson on our Women Who Code team that is helping to host this session. She's saying there's been some talk about the salary gap between IC and management. Do you think there is some unpaid emotional labor there?
Probably. Yeah. I would say most likely. They are both very, very challenging roles. They're just different. And yeah.
Yeah, I would interject like the same. I've done management as well as IC, and they're both, equally hard, really. It's just different skills, and I think a lot of people don't really understand that. So like when you think that people doing different things it looks harder or it looks easier, you think, oh, they should get paid less or they should get paid more. There's a lot more under the covers there.
Yep.
All right. Jordan asks, how did you prep to take on problem-solving tasks early in your career that led you to management? And then any advice for women that aspire to have management roles in the future but are not quite there yet? Double whammy.
Problem-solving tasks. I don't know. I feel like there's so much that's just opportunity based, so it's hard to give exact advice here. But I know, like my current company, we try to make sure that every developer on the team leads a project. And if you're super junior, it's going to be a very, very tiny project, but you're still leading that project for the team. So it gives you some of those skills, and usually there's a couple people there to like help make sure that you're doing things, but you still get that chance. So I think if you can find a situation like that, that's really great. There's other things, like I was mentioning to somebody that this was a little bit more senior in my career, but I got the chance to be on an API working group, which it's a team that worked across like all of our teams that built APIs, right? So like almost all of backend. And because it was a very specific skill, they allowed a more junior person to join that thing. And so I got the experience of how do I work across multiple teams, and how do I, work with a bunch of people and influence people and make sure people are doing things in a good way, like well before I probably would have gotten that chance as a normal engineer. So there are opportunities like that. Yeah, a lot of it for me is just like anytime a manager came to me with something that I thought was going to grow me, I would say yes. So not being scared, like even when I was scared, I would be like, okay, we're going to try this. We're going to do this.
That's awesome. All right, so a question was skipped. Is imposter syndrome a thing for you? And if so, what was it different as a manager? Good question.
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes I'm like, there are days when I'm like, oh, everybody around me is an idiot. Like, I'm amazing. Like, yeah, I've got this. And then there's other days when I'm like, wait, they trust me to make these decisions? Like, oh my God, like, how am I going to do this? Like, this is crazy. So yeah, sometimes. And yeah, it was both sides of things. I feel with the manager side, I was forced to confront it more, just because you are in those meetings, you are giving the status updates, you're like, you have to do these things. Whereas on the IC track, like if I don't do those things, I'm probably not going to advance, but I'm probably not going to get in trouble either, right? So it's a little easier to avoid it, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but yeah.
I think it's like whatever your path is that you want to, All right, Alicia asks, when you say all devs on the team lead a project, what does it mean for a dev to lead a project?
Yeah, so for us, they write the design doc. So they come up with like, what exactly are we going to build? For all of our design docs, we run it by the entire team before anything happens anyway, but they're the ones responsible for putting that together. They're the ones responsible for then breaking that into tasks. So they actually create all the JIRA tickets for the whole thing. And then they're also the one responsible for like figuring out what the next thing we should be working on is. So like which of those tickets actually go into the sprint, and then like keeping track with the manager of like, how is the project moving forward? So yeah.
Awesome. We're going to start wrapping up here soon. We've got about 4 minutes left, just so everybody knows, but we've got time for a little bit more questions. Caitlin asks, does anyone start in management and then move into being an IC?
In software, I haven't seen it. Yeah, I haven't seen it. I'm sure there are some industries where that might happen, but yeah, in software, usually we want people to have some sort of technical background. Occasionally you'll see somebody move from a different or like a related industry that was a manager there, and they'll move across as a manager, but yeah.
I've seen in a couple of rare cases where folks did some self-learning while they're a manager and then moved into like a junior IC type role, like usually under a different engineering org or something like that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't happen terribly often.
Yeah.
All right, any more questions? We've got, Susan asks, some people think as you get older, it's easier to keep a job being a manager than an IC. What are your thoughts in terms of job security? And I would say ageism maybe is what they're going at here.
Maybe. For me, so far, I have not felt that. In fact, senior engineers are super in demand, like staff plus is super in demand. It's occasionally been a little bit more challenging because people, like some companies will look at exact skill set and like exact tech stack background and stuff. And like if you don't match what they're looking for, they might not hire you into a senior level. But that said, like there are also companies like my current one, which was more about like, are you willing to learn? Are you willing to like, have you shown the leadership skills in the past and like that kind of thing? So yeah.
It's an interesting question. All right, we've got 2 minutes left. Let's see. Just checking to see how many questions we can do. Okay. A few more questions for you. You gave us lots of extra QA time, which is awesome. Thank you for that. Mariana asks, well, if I choose to stay in the IC track, is it possible to move to manager or to management later? Are there cases like that?
Yes, definitely. In fact, my current manager, we're probably similar levels, but yeah, I guess I don't know exactly, but I assume we are. But yeah, she only moved into management, I don't know, within the last few years versus I obviously moved a while ago. So yeah.
Okay, and then I think maybe we've got time for the one more. How do we better communicate and be an effective leader? That's a big question.
Communicating, I would say practice. Like the writing, the blogging, like we had like littler things within our company. There were like internal blogs. There was, we did these, what they call them, performance on the pots, which are like little write-ups they posted in the bathrooms. So I would just like try to force myself to do some of those every so often. And then finding ways to, like I started a newsletter for my team because I noticed that other people didn't really know what we're working on. So I would try to put that together like once every month or two. So like forcing myself to just practice the communicating, and then it becomes easier and easier. And getting feedback from mentors or close peers that will give you honest feedback is also super helpful.
Awesome. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much, Joy, for sharing your story and your experience and answering all of these awesome questions. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for enjoying this talk. Go ahead and make sure to check out the other sessions that are going on, check out the networking features. There are expo booths for the sponsors, and then, yeah, just enjoy your time at the Connect Forward. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.